We have embraced a very humanistic approach to human development, and the UNESCO's, well, you see it right behind Eva on her backdrop. What this initiative on the futures of education seeks to do is to ask how we can best use knowledge and learning to shape the futures of humanity and the planet. So let me begin with the overarching argument of the report in a nutshell. So many of us are increasingly aware that the world's at a turning point. And if we're honest with ourselves, we know that if we keep doing more of the same, even if faster and more efficiently, we're heading towards a cliff. So we face a choice. We can continue on an unsustainable path or radically change course. And we know that education has great power to bring about change. Knowledge and learning are essential for any social transformation. But nowadays, at present, the ways that we organize education don't do enough to ensure justice, to ensure peace, and a healthy planet. And in fact, some of our problems come from how we educate. So the primary argument of this new report is that we need a new social contract for education that can both repair past injustices and transform the future. This is a foresight envisioning exercise. Just to pause for 1 second and explain the context. This is a foresight envisioning exercise that UNESCO has engaged in since its founding 75 years ago, roughly once a generation. The organization has set up an international commission, accessed public and expert views on the situation at present, what we foresee for the future, and the role that education can most optimally play. So the first of these reports, you may know, was the 4 Commission report, came out in 1972, Learning to Be. It warned about global inequalities, and it's one of the pieces that arguably put the notion of lifelong learning on the global education agenda. Some of you may be more familiar with the 1996 Delors report, Learning the Treasure Within, which offered an integrated humanistic vision of education around 4 pillars, the idea of learning to be, learning to know, learning to do, and learning to live together. So this latest report similarly presents a forward-looking view of education and lays out an agenda for dialogue and action at multiple levels. So there's some interesting differences between the reports. Earlier reports talk about the evolution of education, and in the Reimagining Our Futures Together report, there's a call for more fundamental or radical change. There's also a slightly stronger focus on higher education in the current report. And then there are some really key differences in leadership and public and expert engagement. So the report, which we also call the SADE Work report, was put together under the leadership of Her Excellency, Madam Sahle-Work Zewde, the President of Ethiopia. So the switch from actually both former French ministers to a female leader from the global south is noteworthy. The president was joined by 17 other global thought leaders from different areas of work, different parts of the world, and they formed UNESCO's International Commission on the Futures of Education. But just as importantly, the report was prepared through a process of co-construction and dialogue that in the end engaged over 1 million people from around the world, including many of the people on this call. So there were tracks of expert engagement, also public engagement. We conducted focus groups. People offered their ideas in meetings, webinars. We had online platforms, polls, and surveys. And this broad, open kind of process of co-construction involved youth, educators, civil society, governments, business, I mean, really the wide range of stakeholders. And I can go into more detail on that if people are interested during the discussion afterwards. So let me kind of dive more deeply into the report by kind of offering maybe the key takeaways on what the report has to say about necessary changes to why we learn, what we learn, and how we learn. So the first thing it does is ask us to press reset on the question of why we learn. So in place of a narrow focus on education for national citizenship or education to support development efforts, the Commission calls for education to build individual and collective capacity to transform. So this means centering individuals, communities, countries in education to enact transformational change. There's also a call for a massive updating of what we learn. So this may not be the case in Sweden, but in many parts of the world today, discrete subject knowledge is handed to students in educational institutions, without much connection to everyday lives or contemporary challenges. And instead, the report proposes that curricula and learning objectives need to focus on ecological, intercultural, and interdisciplinary learning. And those are three different things, but the thread that connects them is the requirement that we move from thinking in terms of categories to thinking in terms of connections. Finally, the report warns against worrisome trends in how we learn. So one thing we see nowadays is the displacement of schooling into domestic spaces. We also see proposals to automate learning. And in some places we see a really crass commercialization that's exacerbating inequalities and undermining public education. So the call in the report is for all actors involved in education to commit to supporting education as a public societal endeavor and to strengthening education as a common good. So the report begins with an assessment of the state of the world. Long-term trends show that we've come a long way in education in terms of access and gender equality, but progress has been uneven. And many of today's gaps are based on yesterday's exclusions and injustices. For example, 1 in 5 children in low-income countries and 1 in 10 across the world is still out of school, and this is even before COVID. Close to 90% of students in low-income countries leave school before completing secondary education. And of course, COVID has greatly worsened these problems and exacerbated inequalities. So we also face, in addition to the problems at hand, we also face a number of key emerging disruptions and uncertain futures. The planet is in great peril, but there is, of course, tremendous momentum to heal it. Democratic governance is under attack, but at the same time, we see citizen participation growing. Digital technologies don't always deliver on their promises, but at the same time, they have huge potential. And I'll go into more detail in this later in the presentation, as I mentioned. And finally, ensuring that work remains human-centered is getting more and more difficult, but at the same time, greater attention is being paid to purpose and work that matters. So we're at a moment where, to many, things feel very out of balance. And the call in the report is for us to think together, work together on relearning our interdependencies and rebalancing our relationships with each other, with the living planet Earth, and also with technologies. And it's important that, as we confront these challenges, it's essential that education not simply react and adapt, but play a key role in shaping, informing, and making, creating, bringing about the futures that we want. So the proposal for realizing that is a call to work together to make a new social contract for education. The concept of social contract is a freighted term. It's a difficult term. I would say that in this report, the effort is to see this contract less in transactional terms and more in relational terms. How do we set up the relationships in our societies in ways that will serve us all well together? So the report puts forth kind of three axes on which we need to build and think about a new social contract for education. The first is to examine the core values, the foundational principles that are embedded in our education system. The second, and I'll go into each of these in a little bit of detail. The second is to examine how learning is organized, the ways we design our education systems, our education processes, formal, informal, non-formal. And then finally, to give attention to the actors and actions, the ways that we build, maintain, improve education, as well as who's involved in this. So the foundational principles that are put forward in the report is first to commit to assuring and in fact broadening throughout life. The right human rights over 75 years ago, it needs to be safeguarded and strengthened, but it also needs to be expanded to include the right to information, the right to science, and possibly the right to connectivity. And then second, a kind of core commitment that's called for in the report is a commitment to strengthening education as a public endeavor, a public societal endeavor. Education is something that can help us build common purposes. It can help individuals and communities to flourish together. And an emphasis on participation is what strengthens education as a common good, a form of shared well-being that's chosen and achieved together. So as you see in this quote from SADE work, the call is for these two principles to become foundational to education everywhere, and in this way will benefit collectively from the rich tapestry of different ways of knowing and being in the world. In terms of how learning is organized, we propose thinking of this on 5 different dimensions. The first is pedagogy. So the relationships that are set up between learners, teachers, knowledge, competencies in the world. In many parts of the world nowadays, there is a focus on teacher-driven lessons, and despite the fact that groups of learners come together in the same spaces, efforts are overwhelmingly directed at individual accomplishment. So there's a huge missed opportunity to leverage, what can be learned and accomplished by virtue of the fact that we're bringing people together to learn together. So the report proposes that in a new social contract for education, pedagogy should be organized around cooperation, collaboration, and solidarity. In many places today, curricula are organized as a kind of grid of subjects. And as I mentioned earlier, the report calls for a shift to an emphasis on ecological, intercultural, interdisciplinary learning. And one piece of this is that the idea that education should enable everyone everywhere to access the knowledge commons, humanity's diverse and ever evolving reservoirs of accumulated knowledge. And not just access. In addition to ensuring that right to access, the call is for education to support people to contribute to the knowledge commons, to create knowledge, and also to broaden and make that shared human resource more inclusive. Teaching, in many parts of the world, teaching is considered an individual practice, something that occurs behind a closed classroom door. But instead, we need to further professionalize teaching as a collaborative endeavor, where the autonomy and freedom of teachers is supported, where they become valuable participants in public debates on the futures of education. And that may be well advanced in Sweden, you can tell me. Each of these topics is given a whole chapter in the report, and each of the chapters get pretty granular. The school. The school became a global institution across the 20th century. It's a necessary global institution, but with that spread, a certain universal architectural, procedural model, set of norms were imposed. And the report's very clear that schools should be both safeguarded as protected sites of learning, but simultaneously reimagined in diverse ways. And you've probably caught already that the idea of futures in the plural is a key idea in the report. And there's very much the idea that there will be multiple futures of education. And then finally, the report calls for us to think carefully about the broader educational ecosystems, learning in all times and spaces, and ensure that our efforts are focused on welcoming and expanding learning opportunities, at all times and spaces. So the third part of a new social contract for education is to think about action and actors, how we will build this. So in addition to the foundational principles, the key design features of a new social contract, the report calls for everyone everywhere to be able to take part in this process of reimagining our futures together. So the report recognizes the importance of research, calls for a worldwide collaborative research program that welcomes the contributions of diverse actors, different forms of knowledge. The report also recognizes that we're going to need stronger global collaboration and more equitable cooperation. And then finally, we'll need everyone, students, teachers, parents, school leaders, policymakers, civil society, to join in and make these transformations a reality in their schools and communities. And the very end of my presentation, I'll close with some thoughts on how we can move forward on that. Before diving into technology for a second, I just want to highlight some of the high-level recommendations, first on public education and second on the planet and the environment. So the report, the International Commission's, as UNESCO is deeply committed to education being a public endeavor. So in other words, something that occurs in a public space, something that promotes public interests, and something that's accountable to all. And we have to not forget that public education is what creates publics, what educates publics, and reinforces our belonging to the same humanity. The report acknowledges the role that what are sometimes called non-state actors can play in ensuring the right to education, particularly when they're safeguarding principles of non-discrimination, equality of opportunity, social justice. But it argues that markets should not be permitted to further impede on education as a human right. It calls on governments increasingly to focus on regulation and on protecting education from commercialization. I mean, really, it argues that we need to ensure that education now and in the future remains a common good, and doesn't simply become a market good. So I think it's also worth noting that the report contains a set of high-level recommendations related to the planet and the environment. You know, one of the crazy things today is that the most educated countries, the most educated people are typically the ones most accelerating climate change. So reimagining our futures together calls out the economic models that prioritize short-term profits, excessive consumerism, as well as the acquisitive individualism, the competitiveness, frankly, the lack of empathy that characterizes too many of our societies around the globe. So if being educated means living unsustainably, then we clearly need to recalibrate our notions of what education should do. And this means rebalancing our relationships not only with nature, but with each other. The report argues that the long-term action that's required to reverse climate change and the environmental destruction that we see on our planet requires a radical change in how we think about our relationship with planet Earth. The capacity to live in harmony with our natural environment, taking no more than is needed for our individual and shared well-being, is something to be learned through education. And the ecological crisis we face requires curricula that fundamentally reorient the place of humans in the world. Finally, I think the report gives a lot of attention, and it's threaded throughout, to necessary steps we need to take to steer the digital transformation of education, but also the digital transformation of our societies, even our interpersonal relationships. You know, digitalization is reshaping the ways we live and learn. You know, clearly digital technologies, particularly those that are geared towards enhancing connectivity, can enrich educational processes, can improve some learning outcomes, but it's really critical that these be bent in the direction of supporting human rights, enhancing human capabilities, and also facilitating the collective action that we need in the direction of peace, justice, and sustainability. But I think there's a lot of work yet ahead for us to be able to do that. I mean, to begin, you know, there are a lot of inherent contradictions in digitalization and digital technologies. But you know, in this respect, the so-called digital revolution is really no different than other great moments of technological change. You know, like the agricultural revolution or the industrial revolution, you know, where major collective gains come with worrisome increases in inequality and exclusion. You know, we see, for example, and I'm telling you something you know very well, that connectivity rates are really asymmetrical globally. There are huge digital divides, digital gaps. You know, globally, you know, approximately 2 out of every 3 children and youth have no internet access at home. At the same time, in some countries, it's not uncommon for an average person to spend as many as 10 hours a day online and immersed in digital technology. So basically, the world of education is caught up in a set of really varied, provisional and emergent relationships with digital technologies. You know, we see computers used in many classrooms and homes around the world. Mobile phones are increasingly used in diverse educational settings. They're beginning to play a larger role in resource-poor areas. But digital skill gaps on the part of students and teachers still present major barriers to technology use in education. You know, many of us, I think, and I realize I'm speaking to a group of people who are far more expert on this than I am, but many of us recognize that the vast and exciting educational potential of the internet, email, mobile data, videos, audio streaming, you know, as well as the increasingly sophisticated collaboration tools that are becoming increasingly available, you know, is also accompanied by many human rights questions, for example, around the right to information, the right to privacy, the right to culture, to democratic participation. I mean, basically the scenario that the scene that the report sets up is this idea that we're at a moment where digital technologies have the potential to strengthen and weaken core principles of human dignity, and core human rights. When we look to the future, we see a range of possible scenarios and outcomes. We are perhaps on the cusp of really significant transformations in human meaning making. The data that can emerge through digital processes, the increases in storability, transmissibility, and searchability, on the one hand, tremendously increase our computational powers, right? But this may also be accompanied by a sidelining or a marginalization of ways of knowing that are not digitizable. For example, indigenous, low tech, the ephemeral, the spiritual, non-commoditized forms of knowing. We also see the risk of an increasing substitution of machines for human decision making. And maybe that's not always a risk. Maybe that's something desirable. But clearly, algorithmic, machine learning, AI is already in the process of changing our social and political decision making, where human judgment is potentially replaced with technological processes. On the one hand, this could bring transparency, perhaps greater objectivity, perhaps greater fairness, but it can also be cloaked in secrecy and complexity. We also see the possible erosion of intellectual and personal freedom. We all know that digital technology, I noticed someone pressed record earlier, digital technology increases the possibility for surveillance and control. It creates increased room for abuse, and the erosion of intellectual freedom by authorities, by political authorities, by corporations, by oligarchic regimes. We also see a tight, intermingling of digital technology and commercial interests. In education, the most common digital platforms that are used today globally are really designed foremost to meet the business objectives of their proprietors. For example, by selling advertising, or as we now see, like an increasing reliance on the harvesting of user data, right, and the use of it for other purposes. It's possible that we'll see the expansion of this, but it's also possible that the many open code, open educational resources, the public options in development could shift this landscape in years to come. So I probably should have fixed this slide. These are not really trends. I mean, these are not, with technology, it's very hard to do trend analysis. I mean, we really have a set of possibilities in front of us, and the argument that I would make, and that the report makes, is that it's in our hands, and in fact, we have a huge responsibility to steer these in the directions we want them to be steered. The final thing just to mention in terms of future trends that are considered in the report is the increasing living life, maybe even learning in virtual worlds, where we're displacing our social, our political, our cultural, our economic, even our interpersonal relationships into virtual spaces. And this obviously will profoundly change human relationships, interactions, even our aspirations, our thought patterns, along with our core approaches to teaching and learning. So let me go into the recommendations of the report on how to steer the digital transformation in ways that will serve us, serve our planet. The first is to ensure that digital technology empowers and connects people. So we need to make sure that it supports learner well-being, alongside The use of technology in education, we need to have efforts to avoid and address the potential for isolation, loneliness, and anxiety that can emerge. We need increased public investment in open education, open digital resources, public platforms, educational resources that are not dependent on commercial interests, that are instead based on a commitment to the common good. We also need to, and I think this is really important, we need to build capacity to determine how technologies is used. So I think what that means to me is we think of digital skills not as a one-way street, not as students and teachers learning how to use digital technologies, but also learning how to steer the use of digital technologies, so that students and learners become empowered to act together on technology and determine, how it's used not only in education, but in their societies and for what purposes. Finally, we clearly need a lot of respect for offline life worlds, to ensure that our frequent rush for technological solutionism doesn't consume non-digital forms of knowing and learning. And in fact, I'd suggest that we should debate whether a right to connectivity needs to be paired with a right to non-connectivity. The second area of steering the digital transformation of education is to center the most marginalized. So to commit resources to closing digital divides, but also to ensure that digitalization supports rather than threatens cultural diversity. And this means adopting principles of inclusive design. Instead of beginning, with digital innovations that benefit privileged learners first, and then are spread out to the more vulnerable and marginalized, we flip this and begin with learners who are most in need of greater opportunities, in the most fragile circumstances, and then scale that out to privileged communities. Finally, the third area of work around steering the digital transformation of education is that we insist that technology foremost serve education. That doesn't always happen. There's an English expression that the tail wags the dog at times. I'm not sure if there's something similar in Swedish, but it's to ensure that the technology doesn't determine what we do, that education determines what we do with technology, our educational goals and interests. So there's a strong call, as I mentioned earlier in the report, to safeguard and transform schools. And there's an urging that digital technology support and be designed to support and not to replace schools. The COVID-19 pandemic has shown that school fully displaced into virtual spaces, fully remote online schooling is a poor substitute for the positive learning environments that schools can provide. We can discuss that. There's also a call to leverage digital connectivity to enhance access to knowledge. Open access to texts and arts from around the world is one of the most powerful things that we have in education today that we didn't have 30, 40 years ago. And it's worth thinking about open access not only as open to attain and become acquainted with, but also open to tinker and use and manipulate. There's great potential. We need to think about increasingly about the ways digital tools can support creation, can support communication. At the same time, we need to insist on strict data protections, providing a high level of protection for the privacy of teacher and student data. We need to make sure that educational data is helping to improve teaching and learning rather than merely documenting or controlling it. And then finally, we need to ensure ethical use of AI and algorithms. When we bring AI and digital algorithms into schools, into educational settings, we need to ensure that the data sets that they're trained on don't reproduce existing stereotypes and existing systems of exclusion. So I just have given you a lot. And I want to close with sort of where the report leads us, which is, I think, a sense that there's a huge urgency to the action, but also that there's a lot of reason to be hopeful. You know, we have at this point greater access to knowledge, more tools that let us collaborate than ever before in human history. You know, education has long played a role in transforming our world, you know, but clearly to shape peaceful, just, sustainable futures, we need to further transform education. So the call in the report is to renew education. And this doesn't mean, you know, tearing everything down and starting from scratch. No, a renewal means basing our efforts on what we know and what we hope for. And so the report both begins and closes with 3 questions that are questions that inform the Commission's analysis, and they're questions that I think we all need to take forward in our work individually, in our work with schools, and our work with learners in all settings. The first is to ask, you know, what are we doing in education that we should continue doing, right? You know, let's do some stock taking of some of our assets. You know, what is it that we do that might need to be strengthened, that might need to be protected, right? But then a second question is, you know, what are we doing now that we need to stop doing, right? What do we need to abandon, or what do we need to unlearn? And then a third question is, what are we not doing? What are we not doing well enough? What needs to be creatively reimagined afresh, right? And these then become the basis for collective thinking and collective action that can be the process through which, as is proposed here, a new social contract for education can be built. If you follow me, they can also be asked, these are questions that can be asked in a fractal way. You can ask them of a classroom, of a school system, of a whole sector, right? And they're useful questions, I think, for making futures of education together. So I will close with that and look forward to comments and questions and engaging in the little bit of time that we have left. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Noah. Quite the wide spectrum, and many thanks. I wrote down some questions, but I think I'll wait a little bit with them and see if our audience want to ask you some questions about this report, a new social contract. So is there any questions to Noah? You can write in the chat board, or you can put on your microphone and ask a question to Noah. We're welcome. Yeah, I can perhaps. Yeah, is there any questions? Yeah.
Yes, I have a question.
Okay, welcome.
As always. So first of all, Noah, it was just a wonderful presentation, and it's really one of the best work ever, I will say, because it is not just the product as such and the report as such what you have presented for us, but also the process. And what is very amazing is about this human dimensions and also the reach for hope and for aspiration and inclusiveness. I mean, everything. And maybe the most wonderful is about the higher goal, so to say. It's expressed in such a wonderful way about peace, humanity, save the planet, etc., which you have presented for us. It's just wonderful. But actually, my question is, as you know, I have been working on this already since and follow it since its beginning, both with SADE and also with my company and work I'm doing, but also with ICDE, and UNESCO and ICDE are work very close together. So my reflections is more about, I mean, with this wonderful work and the process it has taken during those 2 years with the bottom-up perspectives and dimensions to really include everyone and not leaving anyone behind, and working with all continents and all groups and stakeholders, etc., etc. But and I know that report is rather newly launched, but how is the process forward? I mean, to implement all those wonderful thoughts for a new social contract into member states. How is this reach out to governments, for example, to ministers, to countries, to implement, to make the work going on globally? So maybe if you can elaborate a bit on that.
Sure, sure.
Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you for the wonderful things you said about the process. I mean, I think UNESCO really did this one right. You know, my first, I mean, it sounds like a flip cavalier response, but my first response is like, it's not going to be UNESCO, it's not going to be governments. Are we still recording? Anyway, it's going to be the million people who participated up to this point and the millions more that take it forward.
Yes.
But clearly UNESCO has a role to play, as do governments. You know, as you saw when I went through steering the digital transformation, we get pretty granular in the report. I mean, it's a visioning document. And I probably should have said this. I mean, I know you know it, but it's not a blueprint. It's not a roadmap. It's very clear that it's not. And in fact, some people have sort of pushed back and said, well, wait, tell us what to do. And our response is, no, you need to figure out what you're going to do, because it's going to look different in different places. It's going to look different, you know, with different levels. And, you know, what we've put forward in the report are a whole set of, I mean, kind of globally sourced ideas about things we need to think about, things we might need to do together. So here's what we're doing. I mean, we do want people to read the report, right? We think there's a lot of value in the ideas in it. So we want people to read and respond and improve it and build together. So events like this, I think, are a great way we can do this. I mean, hopefully you'll come away with some ideas. You'll hopefully take some of these conversations, you know, further out into, if you're a teacher or a professor, into your work with your students. I think there are ways that the report can be improved on. You know, we have on the UNESCO website an ideas lab. We're posting pieces. If any of you are kind of inspired to, you know, critique an element or call for it to be built, or you know, go further, please, you know, put something together. So encouraging debate and discussion and dialogue, you know, among a wide group. Is one way we're taking it forward. Another way we're taking it forward is to look at case studies and examples. So here we're encouraging a lot of so we had over 200 organizations that, including SADE, that did focus groups and participated in that project in the co-construction consultation. You know, a lot of what's put forward in the report is based on what we know is being done that's successful in the world. We did not, as you know, we did not layer example after example in the report. Maybe we should have. The reasons for that, honestly, were time and effort, and needing to ensure that, you know, whatever examples we offered were globally representative. The thing is, examples can date quickly, and we really want this report to have a long shelf life. But we are encouraging people to, you know, highlight, you know, through their work, through publications, through workshops and seminars and conferences, things they're doing that are already taking the report ideas forwards.
Yeah.
We're also going to be or already launching regional and sub-regional launches of the report, which is being translated now into 8 additional languages. And basically every week, it seems like we're signing up a new language. And then in terms of some of the more official mechanisms, the UN Secretary General has called for a Transforming Education Summit to take place in September in New York. And UNESCO is actually leading UN agencies. It's a cross-UN effort on the Transforming Education Summit. There'll be a call for national consultations, national multi-stakeholder consultations on education to really mobilize both public and political support for the transformation of education. Which for New York is twofold. It's both getting the SDGs back on track. SDG 4 in particular. COVID has really dealt a setback in so many areas. So and ensuring funding for that, and then ensuring that we start to move forward on changes to our education systems that will both help us, achieve the 2030 agenda and help us get to where we really want to be, when we look towards 2050 and beyond. So there'll be a pre-summit in Paris in June or July, and then the New York event. So yeah, fortunately, UNESCO is very connected to governments, to ministries of education. We had over 40 ministers of education in Paris at the time of the launch in November. So we're working that track as well as a broader public expert track. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you so much. And I think that is also the beauty with this report and with this work, that it really brings everyone on board, and for everyone to take it on and move it forward. And we all have responsibilities for that. And that was also the reason why we wanted to have this session at our conference here with SADE, so we can move further on at our path and in our context.
Yeah, just to add one more.
There is already a call for, as well as you had a call for the consultation, there is a call also how you can roll out it in different contexts.
Exactly. And just to add, I think children and youth, students themselves, are one of the key overlooked levers that we have to transform. And it's really, a lot needs to be in their hands. And there's a really great organization called the World's Largest Lesson, which is charged with educating for the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. And we're currently working with them on making sure their 2022 campaign focuses on engaging students in this processes of educational transformation. So those 3 questions that I left you with, are ones that we think, a 6- and 7-year-old can answer, as well as all of us.
Thank you.
Yeah, I see that Kjell had a question. Is it okay if you speak up, Kjell? Can we hear your question? Thank you very much. Welcome.
I have a question on interdisciplinary learning. I fully agree with you that it's an increasingly important issue. But at the same time, my experience is that it could be a bit complicated, as most of the research are not done interdisciplinary, and also the communication between researchers from different academic disciplines are not always so extensive and vital as it could be. Do you think that's an obstacle for making curriculum more interdisciplinary?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. I guess I think a lot depends on what level we're talking about, what educational level we're talking about. There's a number of words that are used to talk about this mixing of disciplines, transdisciplinary, right? We, in the report, the commission went with interdisciplinary, which I would take as foregrounding the need for disciplinary knowledge to begin with, right, as a basis for then crossing. These are all terms that can be kind of nuanced in many ways. but disciplinary knowledge is important. I mean, a discipline is a particular way of framing questions, has a history of knowledge production, has methods. And it's often sort of the rigorous adherence to those that kind of create these siloed conversations and create some of the problems of bridging them that you're talking about. But I think it's crucial to go back to the level that we're talking about. In primary and secondary education, we have school subjects like math. We have school subjects like literature. At least as terms of math is concerned, learning of math in primary and secondary education has no resemblance to math as an intellectual discipline, right? As practiced in the academy. So I suppose it's probably a little bit cheap to use interdisciplinary in that setting, because we're really not talking about the discipline of math. But as we know, what we're talking about is like an integrated approach where a skilled math teacher can work with a skilled arts teacher, can work with a skilled music teacher, right? And you can make connections through patterns, right? You don't need to teach these as like isolated school subjects. You can bring them together. So interdisciplinary is maybe not the right word for that, but that I think is what's being called for. Then when we get to interdisciplinary and higher interdisciplinarity in higher education, tertiary education and beyond, then I think you run into a lot of problems that you're running into. You were highlighting, Kjell. The need to both train in disciplines, but also to explore the boundaries of disciplines and to cross them. But I don't know, I look at an example like the digital humanities. I mean, the digital humanities is one of the most amazing interdisciplinary fields in universities these days. And they've basically done it just by doing it, right? I mean, there's a lot of theory behind it, but these are people who are just sort of forged ahead and said like, well, what happens when we do this? It's an incredibly creative, imaginative area. So, I mean, I think we achieve interdisciplinarity through that creativity and imagination. So that's the best I got.
Yeah, thank you very much. I see the time runs quickly when we're having an interesting discussion, and we have 2 minutes to go to the next presentation. So I will try to make some summing up. I had one of the questions for you, Noah. It was about, you said in the beginning of your presentation that it was we need to expand the right to quality education. And I also had an introduction meeting with you some weeks ago, and I think we will sum up what your next report, what will that deal with? You told me something.
What did I tell you? What did I tell you?
You told me something about.
Oh yeah. We have a report coming out actually the end of this month, put together by our team at UNESCO, called the EdTech Tragedy, technological solutionism in the COVID era. And honestly, it actually goes to the Greek notion of the tragedy, right? I mean, in the Greek tragedy, the intentions are honorable, right? The intentions are correct, right? Greek tragedy is not about sort of evil doing, right? Greek tragedy is about how the best of intentions can go wrong, and that's the framing of this. It's an examination of ways that our hopes and aspirations for what technology could enable us to do weren't lived up to, didn't deliver, and then it draws lessons from that. What can we learn from the COVID experience of fully remote online learning, partially remote, all the different variations for how we, as I mentioned earlier, steer the digital transformation, and how we basically, how we try and leverage education, use education as a space for creating the worlds we want.
Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to some further reading, and thank you very much, and have a nice Friday afternoon, and we will